The Lifestyle Show, presented by Selina MacKenzie.
Now, The Many Lives of Anne Frank takes a fresh and timely look at the debates around Anne's life and work, including the controversial adaptations of the diary, Anne's evolution as a fictional character, and the ways her story and image have been politically exploited. Here to tell us about the book, welcome its author, Ruth Franklin.
Hello.
Hi, Ruth. Thank you for joining us.
Nice to be here with you. Thank you.
Now, this is right up my street. I'm a big fan. I've read the diary about 4 or 5 times, and every time I've read it, I've noticed something different. Isn't that strange?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's just one of those books that is so rich. And, if you read it at different points in your life as well, you'll see different things in it.
Yeah, indeed. So we're talking about the diary of a young girl who, just for those that don't know, I'm sure most people do, she was sort of trapped in an annex for 2 years because they were in hiding during the war. Now, there have been many books, and there's obviously different adaptations of the actual diary. Why is your book different? What have you found out that's new?
So, growing up as an American Jewish girl, Anne Frank was just always an important presence for me. She just was always there in the culture. And as I grew older, I started to hear news stories about missing pages from the diary that had been discovered or other different versions of it that were out there. And I felt that this is a story about the diary that really hasn't been understood by most people, that it wasn't, a found object, as many people have called it, but actually that the version of the diary that we read, the version that was most commonly published, is a version that Anne herself edited and even rewrote in the hope that her book would find an audience that she would, for her testimony to her persecution by the Nazis.
And it certainly was. I read that her father, Otto, because obviously he was in charge of producing the diary after it was found, that he took out certain parts that he didn't want to be revealed, whether he was protecting his daughter's dignity or whatever it was. But is that true?
Yes. Well, the true story actually is a bit more complicated than that. Yes, many people who do know that the diary was edited believe that Otto Frank censored Anne's words. Sometimes, her thoughts about her body are said to have been taken out, or her sexuality. And in fact, this couldn't be more wrong. And the reverse is true. In an early Dutch publisher did try to take out some of these elements, and Otto, in fact, insisted on putting them back into the English version. So part of the goal of my book is sort of to restore Otto's reputation in this sense, and convey the idea that he wasn't in any way a censor of his daughter, but in fact, it was extremely important to him to get the diary out into the world so that it could be read by the greatest number of people possible. He believed that it was a book that had the true power to do good in the world and work against persecution. And of course, history proves him to have been absolutely right.
Yeah, indeed. So it's been translated into more than 70 languages. Do you think it's been translated exactly? Obviously, you've just explained that Otto Frank did the diary justice as Anne wanted it. But do you think things could have been lost within these adaptations?
Well, I'm sure that's true. And, I am far from an authority on the 70 plus adaptations, but I do know that for the German edition, which was published in the early 50s, shortly after the Dutch version came out in 1947, and then we had the English language version in 1952 and the German language version just before that. And Otto, in fact, worked with the German translator to soften some of Anne's language about the Germans. Of course, the Nazis rightly come in for a great deal of opprobrium. But there were some things that she said that Otto worried, because of course the family were German. They came from Germany. They were German from Frankfurt. They fled to the Netherlands when Anne was only 4 years old in 1933, after Hitler came to power. And they still had many German friends and connections. And so Otto was worried that there are places in the diary where she generalizes about Germans rather than speaking specifically about Nazis. And some of those places were softened. But my understanding is that, that the vast majority of these editions are faithful translations.
Excellent. That's good to hear. And do you think it's true, Ruth, about its discovery? Because we hear that when they were caught and she was deported with her family to Auschwitz, that the police came in, the diary pages were threw on the floor when they did a raid. And was it the secretary that picked it all up and gave it to the father?
Yes, this is such an important part of Anne's story. So, of course, the family were in hiding. They went into hiding in July 1942. It was the Franks and another family, the Van Pelses, who were business associates of Otto's. And then shortly afterward, they were joined by a dentist who was on his own. So in total, there are 8 people hiding in the annex, a very small space. If you've ever been to the Anne Frank house in Amsterdam, you can see the rooms exactly as they, in the form that they were. And people always comment on how extremely close and claustrophobic it is. So they were in hiding there for just over 2 years and 1 month before, and nobody knows exactly what triggered the Gestapo raid on the annex. So they may have been tipped off by somebody. Nobody knows who. There are researchers at the Anne Frank house who actually believe that they may have discovered the people in hiding there by accident, that they were looking for stolen goods and came upon Jews instead. But at any rate, during those 2 years, the Franks and the Van Pelses and the dentist were sustained in hiding by Otto's former employees who were very close friends. One of those was his secretary, Miep Pries, as well as some of the other office employees. And after the annex was raided, and indeed the Nazi officer came in and he apparently was looking for a place to put the very few valuables that he was able to discover there. And he came upon the briefcase that Anne had used to keep her diary in all its versions. She had her original diaries and then these loose sheets of paper on which she was rewriting the diary. And he opened the briefcase and threw everything on the floor and used the briefcase to carry off, I don't even know what valuables. They may have had, candlesticks or something like that. After the raid, Miep and another secretary named Bepp came up to the annex to see if there was anything that could still be salvaged. And that's when they found Anne's diary, or we could say Anne's diaries, on the floor. And they recognized it because, of course, everybody knew that Anne wrote constantly in her diary. And she even shared snippets of it. She would read aloud to Miep and Bepp and some of the annex residents from her writing. And so they recognized it right away and knew how important it was to her. Of course, they didn't know how important it would be to the world. But they gathered up all of the papers that they could find, and Miep put them in her desk and kept them safe in the hope that Anne would someday return. And then when Otto received confirmation, Otto was the only member of the annex, the only one of these 8 residents to survive Auschwitz and return from the war. When he received confirmation that Anne and her sister had tragically died in Bergen-Belsen, Miep gave him the papers that she had kept, and she said to him, "This is your daughter's legacy to you."
Wow. And the actual diary itself, the red plaid diary, was a present for her 13th birthday from Otto, from her father.
That's right. It's such a lovely story. She longed to keep a diary. She received it for her 13th birthday. And then only a few weeks later, the family had to go into hiding. Mm-hmm. So, what a serendipitous gift.
Yeah, indeed. So did Otto straight away decide that he wanted to get it published? I know that was her dream, and they all knew it was her dream to be a well-known writer. Did he decide straight away, or was he a little bit skeptical whether he should or not?
So there are different versions of this story, but my own impression from reading Otto's correspondence about it is that he did pretty much decide straight away that he wanted to publish it. He saw it right away that it was an extraordinary document, and he had a little trouble convincing other people around him. Some of his friends and even family members thought, the reason this diary is so meaningful is because we know the wonderful girl who wrote it. And he even received feedback from some of his colleagues. People said, literally, somebody said to him, "Who's going to read this?" because, it wasn't, and I think one thing we don't quite understand is the way that Anne's diary paved a path for the idea that an adolescent girl's voice could be important, could have that kind of, could be that kind of writerly role, because up to that point, the diaries that had been published were mostly by men. There were a few diaries of women artists that had appeared, but the idea that a teenage girl's diary could have the kind of impact that it did, that is where Otto really was a true visionary. Mm-hmm. And the fact that he read the book and understood the power that it could have in the world, I think is just remarkable.
I think it's the innocence behind it, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, I think it's that, Anne's voice somehow is so accessible and so relatable to people all over the world. And, while I was working on this book, I started collecting stories of interesting people who had been influenced by the diary in unusual ways. And, one of my favorites is the story of a refugee from Eritrea, a man who was caught up in that country's civil war. He fled to Ethiopia, and he came upon an English translation of the diary in an Ethiopian refugee camp. And the book spoke to him so deeply that he decided to translate it into his native Eritrean language so that his fellow countrymen could all read it and appreciate it. And, the fact that her voice speaks to people, in Eritrea, in South Africa, it was beloved by the anti-apartheid activists who read it on Robben Island. It's a bestseller in Japan, where, it apparently was one of the first books ever to write explicitly about a girl getting her first period. So, there's that element, the adolescent girl growing up and coming of age under these extraordinary circumstances. And then there's, of course, there's her relationship with Peter Van Pels, the romantic relationship she has with the boy who's in hiding with her, which I think is also an important part of why people identify so strongly with this story, because, of course, we've all had that experience of being in love for the first time.
Yeah, but not stuck in a small annex with the only boy your age.
Indeed. But, I think it's quite unusual to have that experience narrated from the inside the way Anne does, walking us through, all the kind of ups and downs of this first crush. She writes, Peter didn't look at me today. Oh, Peter does seem to have noticed me. She writes about their first kiss. And it's this really poignant moment of sweetness amid all of the stress and incredible tension that they're experiencing.
Yeah, it is. And we're no clearer then, Ruth, to who betrayed them, if anybody did?
We don't know. There's been all sorts of theories. My own understanding is that I doubt that we'll ever find out. There's just too much time has gone by. A lot of people have been interviewed without any kind of conclusion. But, I think the important thing to remember is that in the end, it doesn't really matter. It's the Nazis who are responsible for the death of Anne Frank.
Yeah. So this isn't your first book, I believe.
That's right. I've also written a biography of the American writer Shirley Jackson, which some of your readers some of your listeners in the UK might know, and a book about Holocaust literature called A Thousand Darknesses.
Great stuff. Well, I certainly will be reading this book, which is called The Many Lives of Anne Frank. It's by Ruth Franklin, who we're speaking to now. And as always, we're selling it on our website, TRE.radio. And to visit Anne Frank's house has been on my bucket list for years, and I've not got there yet. Have you actually been, Ruth?
I have, yes. I actually visited as a child, and I went back while I was researching this book, and I highly recommend it. I think it's a very moving experience.
Yes, I'm sure. Well, thank you for telling us a little bit more about this amazing young heroine story, and thank you for joining us on today's show.
Thank you so much. Lovely to speak with you.
You too. Bye-bye.